what's really helped my channel to grow this year through SEO? Talking about Anne Boleyn. Considering the Boleyns have been dead for about 500 years, they've had a very good PR-heavy year. When I made my video on the Anne Boleyn portrait speculation, I genuinely didn't know we were going to get a 3-part docudrama with Jodie Turner-Smith or a 3-part docudrama about the legacy of the Boleyn family. And while I'm not someone to chase trends, it never hurts to be part of an ongoing conversation. I'm not overly interested in producing biographical videos. I don't have anything new to say, and I have genuinely no desire to produce twinkly biographical videos about dead white women. It's just, I'm not. That's not my bag.
I don't even know what this is. This sort of thing ain't my bag, baby.
But I do have something to bring to the table regarding Anne Boleyn that brings up interesting discussions on historiography, analysis versus evidence, and a wee bit of stan culture. So, when was Anne Boleyn born?
Oh, here we go. Is that what you said? And now he's going round like off with her head.
You'd think knowing the birth date for one of England's most famous queens would be well known. You know, who wouldn't know that? But the year that Anne Boleyn was born has actually been at the centre of a historiographical debate for over 100 years, with different historians taking different entrenched positions about different potential birth years. The woman was a Queen of England. She was possibly the most famous one ever. She was a key part of forming a brand new religion, and we don't know when she was born. If there's any woman in history who should have her birthday recorded, you'd think it would be Anne Boleyn, considering the maelstrom that occurred around her. But actually, out of all of Henry VIII's wives, we only have definite birth dates for 2 of them. Catherine of Aragon on the 16th of December 1485 and Anne of Cleves in 1515. There's another debate about whether she was born in June or September, but that's like a whole different debate that people aren't interested in because she's like not sexy or something. There is no formal record of when Anne Boleyn was born. The Boleyn family were based at both Blickling Hall in Norfolk and Hever Castle in Kent, and there are no parish records at either church recording her date of birth. Some people have said this is because she's a woman and people didn't value women then. This is not necessarily because she's a woman, as some people like to claim without really looking into it any further. We don't have exact days of birth for plenty of her male contemporaries too, like Thomas Wyatt or Francis Weston. Recording births and christenings didn't become standard practice until about 1538, well into the Henrician Reformation. We don't have the birth order of the Boleyn children. Mary, George and Anne were the only surviving children, but we know there were at least 2 others, sons called Thomas and Henry, and that children were born on a regular basis from around 1499 to perhaps 1510. Perhaps. We have no idea. Within the family, it was clear that Anne was a younger sibling. George Carey, 2nd Baron Hunsdon, claimed the title of the Earldom of Ormond in 1596 on the basis that his grandmother, Mary Boleyn, was the eldest child, a claim he was unlikely to make unless he could back it up with proof or knew that others would not correct him. Mary Boleyn was also the first Boleyn child to be married in 1520, suggesting that she was perhaps the eldest of the surviving children. Most historians accept a birth date of around 1499 to 1500 for Mary. George Boleyn is thought to have been born around 1502 or 1504. A poem that was written about him when he gained a place on the Privy Council in 1529 gives his age as thrice 9, so around 27, and you extrapolate back from that to try and work out his birth year. With dates for George and Mary, where does that leave Anne? Contemporary historians give contradictory evidence. An Italian chronicler gave a date of 1499, perhaps confusing the 2 Boleyn sisters, while William Roper, son-in-law of Thomas More, thought she was born in 1512. the date that is far too late. A general blanket time period of 1501 to 1507 is given for Anne, with historians either supporting 1501 or 1507. The key piece of evidence that is used in debating the 1501 or 1507 divide is a letter written by Anne. It needs a bit of context. So, Thomas Boleyn, father of Anne, was an ambassador and a diplomat. He had a skill with languages and negotiation, working most often in the Low Countries, a region of Europe that's sort of the bit where Belgium and the Netherlands meet, sort of. It's complicated. He was an envoy sent by Henry VIII to treat with Margaret of Austria, Duchess of Savoy, and Governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Margaret was impressed with the charm and skills of Thomas and offered him a place for one of his daughters at her court. Anne was sent to Margaret's court in 1513 and wouldn't go back home to England until 1522, when she was recalled for marriage negotiations with her cousin James Butler, Earl of Ormond. It's important to know that sending away children to the households of friends and family was a really normal and a key part of getting a good education in the 16th century, as it gave children the opportunity to build a network of contacts, polish up key skills, and learn to be dutiful, respectful, and how to socialise in the right circles. Anne wrote this letter in 1514, as she was about to join her sister as part of the household of the French Queen Claude. I'm going to read it out to you. Sir, I understand from your letter that you desire me to be a woman of good reputation when I come to court, and you tell me that the Queen will take the trouble to converse with me, and it gives me great joy to think of talking with such a wise and virtuous person. This will make me all the keener to persevere in speaking French well, and also especially because you have told me to, and have advised me for my own part to work at it as much as I can. The historians that support the 1501 date include Joanna Denny, Alison Weir, Antonia Fraser, and Eric Ives, who is very notable in the field of Anne Boleyn historiography for his seminal and defining biography, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn. They argue that the language in the letter, the composition, and the handwriting proves that Anne must have been in her early teens, and seeing that a maid of honour, the most junior position attending a court that she held, was most often appointed around the age of 12, this proves that she had to have been born in 1501. Fraser goes even further to put her birth in May or June, but I'm not sure what she based that on. I've got my copy of her Six Wives, and she doesn't cite a source for that, as far as I can see. Retha Warnicke is one of the most vocal supporters for the 1507 date. She's a little controversial in Tudor history circles and is pretty well known for her quite out there theories on the fall of Anne Boleyn involving deformed babies, witchcraft, and gay sex. Gay sex aside, she argues that the poor handwriting, grammar errors, and misspellings prove that this letter is more likely to have been written by a child, not a young adolescent, so discounts the 1501 date entirely. There is an awful lot of back and forth about this letter. In my opinion, I would argue that we should discount the letter entirely as a tool to try and work out Anne Boleyn's age. Just put it right to the side, because I don't think it's useful to look at and try and extrapolate about a person's age or state based on the quality of their handwriting. I mean, I've seen a lot of examples of sort of, not like 7-year-old handwriting from the Tudors, but you can see the letters of Elizabeth I and Edward VI when they were about, 11 or 12, and their handwriting at that age is far superior to mine now as a modern 21st century adult who has been writing her since the age of 4. Going on from that, it's worth noting that spellings were not quite formalised at this point. Plenty of people wrote phonetically and with what made sense for them. I read documents where people have spelt the same word multiple different ways on the same page. So, that was a thing in a world without instant spell check and dictionaries. This is also a letter written by a child. whether she's 7 or 12, she's still a child. In a second language, she's only been speaking for a year, so I would expect to see a few mistakes in the grammar. This letter may have been an example of a set exercised by a tutor, dictated as a learning tool for formal tone, practicing a handwriting script, perfecting her written French, that sort of thing. Elizabeth I was producing ancient Greek translations and classical Roman texts at the age of 11. The standard for children then was so radically different to now that I don't think it's worthwhile looking at it with modern eyes and trying to judge. I think we can't look at this letter and argue as to whether or not the 7-year-olds we know in our lives could possibly write this kind of letter, when it is perfectly conceivable that a 7-year-old could do in a world where children of means are expected to speak multiple languages, have an understanding of theology and scripture, behave with correct social etiquette, learn geometry, history, natural science, horse riding, embroidery, playing instruments, dancing, rhetoric. Handwriting, from what I know in my day job, is a learnt skill that requires strength, dexterity, and fine and gross motor skills. What most people don't realise is that handwriting becomes set at a certain age. Essentially, the style you come to write in at about 5 or 6 is generally the way you will write for the rest of your life. Sure, it will get neater and more precise, but the individual style in which we write becomes set and is nearly impossible to change after this point. Coming into write at about age 4 or 5, around 50% of children naturally gravitate towards diagonal joints, or the starting points of writing in cursive. What I'm trying to say is that within a system where posture, movement, and fine motor skills are a core component of education from a young age, and when there is a set style of writing which is rigorously learnt and taught, and they don't allow individual styles of handwriting, how a 7-year-old would write in 1514 would be so different to how a 7-year-old would write now, that unless we had a greater example of Anne Boleyn's handwriting from various stages across her life, I don't think that we can look at this one letter in isolation and accurately judge her potential age. Edward VI was writing in Greek at the age of 11. Elizabeth I was writing theological treatises at the same age. If you look at their handwriting, it's this neat calligraphic style. The expectations for children were so radically different. Let's put the letter to one side and consider the actual historiography and evidence from the era. In terms of the historiography, the 1507 date was accepted by many historians from the 16th century onwards. It seems to have been mostly uncontested until the late 19th century, when Paul Friedman suggested that Anne Boleyn may actually have been born in 1503. Moving Anne's birth date earlier is a more recent trend. So, why was 1507 the accepted date for so long? There are 2 independent contemporary sources that support the 1507 date. There are the memoirs of Jane Dormer, Duchess of Feria. I think that's how it's said. She was an English noblewoman who married a Spanish duke and had strong personal connections with the Tudor family. She was a childhood friend and playmate of Edward VI and an attendant of Mary I, as well as being her close personal friend. In her memoirs, really a remarkable source for a woman from the 16th century. I mean, oof, I'm so glad that she wrote them. She was very specific in stating that when Anne Boleyn was executed, she was not yet 29 years of age. Now, Jane Dormer was no fan of Anne Boleyn, as in fully believing the adultery charges, but she certainly knew enough people with a connection to Anne that would know her age and details about her life to be able to state that as a fact. Not a vague age, it's a very clear and specific recollection, not a, oh, she was 30 or maybe she was around 25, but it's a clear, she was going to be turning 29 after May 1536. William Camden was a historian and scholar who wrote Annals, the first detailed historical account of Elizabeth I's reign, and what makes Annals such an interesting source is that he was essentially producing the official record of her reign. The project was suggested to him by William Cecil, Elizabeth's chief advisor, in 1597, and Camden was given full access to the state archives and the private papers of Cecil himself. If there was any historian who had the ability to work out and have access to documents about the birth date of Anne Boleyn, it was Camden. And in the chapter discussing Elizabeth's early life, he recorded the year of Anne's birth, MDVII, 1507. If a man with access to the full state archives and the documents of the Tudor family records puts 1507 for Anne, that seems pretty substantial. Let's talk about the more speculative evidence for 1507. For a start, Margaret of Austria called Anne La Petite Boleyn, the Little Boleyn. Although nicknames don't have to have specific meanings, why is she the Little Boleyn? When Anne Boleyn joined the household of Claude of France in 1514, she became very close friends with the Queen's younger sister, Princess Renée. In later life, as the Duchess of
Ferrero Rocher.
In later life, as the Duchess of Ferrara, she still spoke fondly of Anne and their friendship. Undimmed by 40 years, that's quite remarkable. Renée was 4 years old in 1514, so it begs the question of what is more likely, a 4 and a 7-year-old being friends, or a 4 and a 13-year-old being friends. There is also the question of what was a reasonable age for Anne to be sent away to a foreign household on the continent by herself. There have been plenty of historians who have said that her maid of honour must be from the age of 12, and it was out of the question for a 6-year-old to take a position at court. Look, if there's anything I've learned about studying history, it's that concrete, definite rules get broken 9 times out of 10. What we would consider small children frequently took official roles at court. At Margaret of Austria's court, where Anne was, there was another English girl, Anne Brandon, who was born in 1506. Lady Jane Grey was a maid of honour to Catherine Parr from the age of 10. Elizabeth Knowles, a cousin of Elizabeth I, served as maid of honour from the age of 9. And George Boleyn was a page boy for Henry VIII from the age of 10. Jobs at court came up rarely, and parents did anything to get their children ahead, even sending them away at an age we would consider being far too young. A letter from Margaret of Austria to Thomas Boleyn seems to confirm Anne being perhaps younger. I have received your letter by the Esquire Bouton, who has presented your daughter to me, who is very welcome, and I am confident of being able to deal with her in a way which will give you satisfaction, so that on your return the 2 of us will need no intermediary other than she. I find her so bright and pleasant for her young age that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you are to me. If Anne was at the age that her maid of honour was supposed to be, then why would Margaret talk of her specifically being of a young age? Margaret of Austria was not the only one to comment on Anne's age. Cardinal Pole described her as being very young. A Don of Cambridge called her young and good-looking, and as late as 1529, Cardinal Wolsey described Anne as being a girl. And in a time period where age was respected over youth, it does kind of feel like a particularly pointed insult that would not work if she were older. And finally, we should consider the order of marriage for the Boleyn siblings. Mary was married in 1520. George married in around 1524. Anne was recalled to England to be married in 1522. That fell through, but the lack of other serious marriage considerations until she began her relationship with Henry VIII in around 1526 suggests there was no hurry to marry her. even after that scandal with Henry Percy. As a member of the highest social order, Anne would have been expected to marry younger than most of the population, with the common sorts tending to marry in their mid to late 20s, the nobility tended to marry in their late teens. If Anne was born in 1501, she would have been around 25 by the time she began her relationship with Henry VIII. Quite a late start for someone with both siblings already married, and for a child of such a prominent and distinguished family. If she were born in 1507, then she would have been 19 in 1526, in the right age range to be considered as a marriageable prospect by her peers. Of course, it's worth pointing out that Jane Seymour is commonly thought to have been born around 1508 and to have been 27 when she married Henry VIII. Now, it's only fair to discuss some of the evidence for the other side, for the 1501 date. A date of 1501 is cited by other contemporary historians. In 1585, Nicholas Sander described Anne as being in her 15th year in 1514. Again, a very specific timing, although he's also a Catholic biographer and genuinely really hated Anne. Just absolutely despised her. Lord Herbert of Cherbury published a biography of Henry VIII in 1649, which, according to Alison Weir, was based on contemporary documentation. Herbert gave that Anne was 20 when she returned from France, which would place Anne's year of birth in either 1501 or 1502. Matthew Parker, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1559, had been a private chaplain to Anne Boleyn and knew her very well. In his letters, he described her as specifically coming from Norfolk, a trait they both shared. I have that a little bit too. I grew up in Norfolk too. For Anne to have been born at Blickling, the Boleyns' Norfolk home, it is more likely that she was born before 1505, as it was in this year that Thomas Boleyn inherited Hever Castle and moved the family there. So if Anne was from Norfolk, it had to happen before this inheritance. The inheritance plays a crucial role in statements made by Thomas Boleyn himself. In the summer of 1536, after both his daughter and son were executed, Thomas wrote to the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Cromwell. He reflected on his marriage and recalled that his early years had been financially straitened because he only had £50 a year to live in his massive country house and his massive estate while the peasants were starving, and because his wife brought him every year a child. As discussed earlier, we know that Thomas Boleyn gained his inheritance in 1505 when his father died. Within this letter, he must have been discussing pregnancies that occurred before 1505, so that the surviving Boleyn children, plus the two others that we know about, were more likely to have been born before this year. I would actually be quite interested in seeing the full content of this letter. I've only seen it quoted, to see the context in which this quote is taken from, because his statement does not completely rule out children being born past this date, and there may have been other pregnancies that have not otherwise been recorded. I also just want to say that people, commentators, historians, they have a very strong habit of taking everything that people said very extremely literally. And one has to wonder whether he meant this statement in an actual, factual, literal sense that every year there was a pregnancy, or he is, exaggerating for effect. He's saying like, oh, every year there was a child because they felt very close together. Again, without being able to ask the man himself, we can't know what he meant by it. On a personal level, so my own conclusion based on the evidence that is commonly discussed, I think I'm more inclined to the 1507 date. William Camden had access to private state documents to compile the official history of Elizabeth I as approved by the state. Jane Dormer was a source extremely hostile towards Anne Boleyn and her legacy, and had no reason to hold back in any case, in any manner. If Anne had been 36, considerably older than the expectations for a bride and first-time mother for a woman of her station, then surely Dormer would have found ways to discuss that negatively within her memoirs. Anne being younger makes her much more valuable as a marriage prospect and makes sense within the marital patterns of her siblings. It puts Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine Howard into a new perspective and a pattern. His marriage to a possible 17-year-old is no longer an outlier within his marital history, but a further expression of his desire to create a new generation of the Tudor dynasty and perhaps his inclination towards younger women. After all, discussions were being had about removing Catherine of Aragon as Henry's wife from her mid-30s, way before he met Anne Boleyn, so a 19-year-old carries the potential of many, many, many years of childbearing, which was the whole dang point of the conflict Henry VIII started with his pursuit of Anne Boleyn. That said, if a lost document turned up tomorrow that was Anne Boleyn's birth record, or a letter that she wrote saying about her birthday and what year she was born in, I would absolutely be overjoyed. And if it confirmed the 1501 date, that would be freaking dope. I try not to be overly wedded to beliefs and interpretations of history. Look, I have my personal theories, my personal worldview, my interpretations of evidence, but I never want to be in a position where I'm so set on a particular idea or theory that I would willingly ignore evidence that contradicts what I would prefer to believe. Looking at you, G.W. Bernard. The reason why I'm saying this is there are strong feelings about Anne Boleyn out in the world. Anne Boleyn's ambiguity, the fact that she is so ubiquitous and yet the details that we know about her life are so vague are what make her so fascinating and so easy to latch onto for a lot of people. She can be anything that you want her to be, as there's so much supposition and assumption made about the small collection of definite facts that we know about her life. And, well, discuss anything to do with Tudor history, especially any of the wives of Henry VIII, and you'll soon find a lot of women who really strongly personally identify with one of the wives. There's even team merchandise and stands for these women who've been dead for 500 years and are historical figures, not characters from a CW show. Anne Boleyn attracts a lot of women very invested in her legend, let's call it, because she inspires a lot of strong emotions. There is a narrative that has her as this intelligent yet seductive woman who gamed a male-dominated system by using her skills and came out on top only to be betrayed by those jealous men and having to be destroyed. She's the perfect figurehead for contemporary female-led history. Anne Boleyn is allowed to girl boss, gaslight, gatekeep, okay?
Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss.
For some, Anne Boleyn being in her mid-30s is more appealing to them, makes more sense in regards to their own contemporary experiences. You know, we see it as being ridiculous that a 36-year-old woman might be considered too old to bear a healthy child again. We would regard it as ridiculous for a man to get rid of a wife in her mid-30s for a younger woman. We would not see it as being too old to be getting married for the first time. But we don't live in the 16th century. I think for some people who may not have studied or been given the chance to study history as an academic vocation, their passion for a place, a time, or a person can be so great, it's often difficult for them to divorce their emotional mind from their academic mind, to consider evidence and discussions from the perspective of being in the 16th century, from the perspective of someone who doesn't know how events are going to turn out and away from our modern cultural conceptions. Anne Boleyn is a romantic figure who, while a victim of great injustice, represents a part of themselves. She was wronged for the mundane reasons that many women are wronged, while also living a life of glamour, fashion and wealth that we can rarely aspire to. Dying at an age that we would consider to be the modern woman's prime further compounds this perception. There are many excellent historians who support the 1501 date. There are slightly fewer historians who support the 1507 date. Without clear evidence, it's unlikely this debate is ever going to be settled. The evidence we do have is mostly contradictory. For my part, that evidence connected so intimately with official documentation and those within her social circle seems to indicate the 1507 date. That the length of historiographical tradition around 1507 and the contextual evidence regarding her family and some comments, for me, would support her being around 28 or 29 at the time of her death. It's just my opinion, man. But I don't know what evidence might be uncovered tomorrow, next week, next year. Someone might grab a shovel and just go dig up her body in the chapel of the Tower of London and determine her age based on her teeth and bones. Until then, I am more in favour of 1507 than I am against it. So, what year do you think Anne Boleyn was born in? 1501? 1507? Or maybe you're picking the wildcard option and going for 1505. There's no historical debate about 1505. Let's just make it a thing. Anne Boleyn 1505 trending on Twitter. Why not? It seems as good as any other date. Why is there no debate about Jane Seymour's birth date? Why aren't we interested in Jane Seymour? Why can't we talk about the Seymours more? They're pretty interesting, but no one seems to care. Then Boleyn's get all the attention. Hashtag Seymour redemption arc. Don't you think it's weird that we have stan culture for dead women from 500 years ago? I think it's weird. Like, share, comment, engage, boost that algorithm, because the Boleyns have been pretty good for my SEO rankings this year. If you'd like to improve my setup of this show that I produce for free, with no budget, while balancing a full-time job, you can donate to my Ko-fi link down below. Maybe you'd like to look at my Amazon wishlist and then send me one of my books that I'd like, using ulterior means, because I don't want to give Jeff Bezos any money, but it's the best place to build a wish list. Anyway, I will see you soon for more potential SEO content. I think this is probably going to be the last thing I do on Anne Boleyn for a while, because people have opinions about Anne Boleyn, and I don't like the way they react when you talk about her. Goodbye! I'm riding that Anne Boleyn SEO train all the way to the bank. Well, not the bank. I don't make any money on this.